Welcome back, advanced procrastinators. We are going to go over Study Guide Chapter 7, Part 1. This chapter is a bit long and really important. So, this is the first part of Chapter 7. So, make sure you've answered these 8 study guide questions before you begin Part 1, which you will be reviewing. And as we're doing the video, make sure you're answering these, checking for understanding questions as we go through it. And please, at the end of the video, turn these in on Canvas. Now, we are looking at Andrew Jackson and the rise of the common man. Basically, given that America was founded on the concept of equality and forming a more perfect union, we're going to look at the rise of the common man and trying to help this equality reach more Americans and recognizing the government's focus on how it impacted the lives of ordinary Americans for the better or the worse as the United States is transitioning from a fledgling nation just trying to survive to actually a young, prosperous nation. Now, as America is transitioning from being in survival mode as a nation to actually now starting to become independent, Americans are going to want to try to make the country a more perfect union, a better place. So, 3 sources of reform, because this is the next chapter is going to be called the Age of Reform. So where does America get this concept from? Like, we want to improve the country. Well, number one, there are democratic impulses from the Revolutionary War that sought to address inequality. America declared independence in order to have equality for all people. Also, the anti-federalists from the Constitution ratifying conventions, right? They want to make sure that they had a Bill of Rights. They want to make sure that their individual rights are protected from government. Also, Jefferson Democrats, Republicans who represented the common farmer. They want to make sure land is available to all people in order to ensure economic opportunity. But at the same time, this is something that's going to change the whole role of government, the market revolution. This is going to change America into a manufacturing and a trading nation. No longer are we going to be a small farming subsistent economy. We're going to be a cash crop economy and or manufacturing economy. Now, reform. What are some of the things that America needs to fix in this nation? Can you give me 3 examples how the United States in the 1820s has not protected life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as equality for all people? And the answer to this is obviously number one, slavery still exists in the country. A country that says every person has a right to their life, not slaves. Domestic abuse and female suffrage. Women are victims of domestic abuse at home. They're also not allowed to vote. You have Indian relocation. You have the forcible removal of Indians. So much for the property part of natural rights. Monopolies are beginning to emerge for some businesses. But the wealthy in America have taken advantage of being the first to try to solidify their position economically in America. And not all white males have voting rights either. In order to vote, you need to be a land owning male. Well, those voting rights are going to be expanded for more white males, making America the most democratic nation in the world. Now, 2 improvements or changes in the North that contributed to an atmosphere of needed change where America's changed and the government's like, well, we've got to grow and adapt and so do the citizens. Well, number one are improvements in transportation. Americans could move around the country more easily and trade between regions. On the map on the lower right, you can see all those lines on there, or the skinny little lines. Those are roads connecting the country. You also have the Erie Canal on the map on the upper right. That green line across New York is a man-made river that connects the Hudson River, Albany, New York City, with Lake Erie. So now New York City becomes the gateway to the West. Also, you have immigrants coming into the country, which is cheap workers for factories. So America is turning into a manufacturing cash crop economy, as I said earlier. Now, what this is going to be called, the government's role in this is going to be called the American System by Henry Clay. And the idea here is Henry Clay wants the federal government to pay for infrastructure to move goods around the country. Because in the lower right-hand corner, you can see exactly what that looks like in action now. In the early 1800s, the South is finally growing cotton. Slavery is reinvigorated with the invention of the cotton gin, and the South becomes the number 1 producer of cotton in the world. Now, this cotton is being sent to England, which has more textile mills than anywhere else in the world, but also now in the Northeast, in blue, they are starting a small textile industry as well too. So the Southern cotton is going to the textiles in the Northeast. The Northeast turns those textiles into clothes, and those clothes are then sent to the West and the South. And in the West is focus on growing food for America. So what we need now is a way to interconnect these three regions together to make sure the goods move around the country. Now, what you have to understand here is, how does the American system change the role of government at this time? It's modernizing government. And the answer to it is, before, the purpose of government was to protect your natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Now the government is actively involved in the economy. Beyond the government just protecting your rights, it's actually getting involved in helping business or Americans make money for the good and growth of the country. Now, the election of 1824 and the corrupt bargain. This is going to be the election of 1800s, probably the first major consequential election in American history where there's a peaceful transfer of power when Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans defeat the Federalists. So that sets a precedent from then on that every election, the president will step down. But this election is the next different election because at this time, the Federalist Party has died out and there's only one political party. So you have four people that run for the presidency. Now, in this election, what happens is Andrew Jackson, who is the image in the middle there, won the most popular votes, but he did not win a majority of the Electoral College. So the 12th Amendment says the House of Representatives will select a president when no candidate earns more than 50% in the Electoral College. Now, is this a fair way to elect a president? To have the House of Representatives, right, elect the president when no one receives a majority of the popular vote? Now, a lot of people say, no, whoever gets the most votes should win. But a counter argument to that is the fact that the winner should have a majority of the country's support. This would prevent a small faction from winning. The Nazi Party gained power in Germany by winning a majority of the vote with only 33%. So it wasn't a 50% majority of Germans that supported him. It just happened to be the highest vote getter. And that's the purpose for the Electoral College or the 12th Amendment. Now, when this happens and goes to the 12th Amendment, Henry Clay, in the lower right-hand corner, who is the father of the American system, and you can see him in blue in the chart, in the blue column, he recognizes that he cannot become president of the United States. But he still has aspirations to become president of the United States. So Clay tells his voters to vote for John Quincy Adams, who's in yellow. And if you combine the blue column with the yellow column, that overtakes Jackson's green column. And when this happens, Adams becomes president of the United States and Clay becomes Secretary of State. And the reason why Secretary of State was so important was that was seen as being the stepping stone to becoming the president. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams, the last four presidents, had all been Secretary of State. So in Clay's mind, he was next in line to become president of the United States. Jackson claimed this was a corrupt bargain because he won the most votes, yet he still lost the election. And Clay had some kind of backroom deal with Adams. Jackson does not win in 1824, but Jackson is elected the president in 1828 in the next election, and Clay will never become president of the United States. Now, three unfavorable political, economic, and social conditions that reformers sought to address. There's so much happening that's changing in this country at this time that there is going to be a reform movement we're going to talk about next with the age of reform and the Second Great Awakening. But what is the foundation that Americans are like, we have to make this country a little better? Politically, what are some problems happening in America? One, women and African Americans still can't vote, obviously. Property ownership was a voting requirement up until the 1820s. You had to own land to vote, which at first wasn't hard to get because there was so much free land. But now, with more and more people coming here and people being concentrated in the East, there's not as much cheap land available. And also, King Caucus. Political parties chose the candidate who would run for an office. It was not a primary system where people could vote for who they thought was the best candidate, like Bernie Sanders coming out of nowhere and maybe taking the lead. A political party like the Democratic Party would say, hey, this is our guy, candidate X. Now, candidate X, in order to get the job, was probably very entrenched with party politics and could very well be corrupt. So the only politicians you get to choose from are one of two corrupt politicians. Economically, what's changing in America? There are factories and manufacturing is beginning, but there are no unions. So workers are working in dangerous conditions with low pay. Most farmers at this time actually cannot afford land. They had to rent themselves out, would put them in a cycle of debt. And there are fluctuations in the business cycle. Yes, America is booming, but then it busts. There's a recession, there's depression, there's inflation, there's deflation. American economic security was never certain. You had money one day, but you could lose it the next day. Just look at what we're going through with the COVID-19 crisis right now. And 2 months ago, no one saw this coming, and all of a sudden, people have been placed out of work and forced into a lockdown. The same thing was happening every so many years based on economic reasons, not the pandemic reasons of COVID-19. And socially, women are second class citizens. Keep this in mind that domestic violence is illegal against your wife at this time. You could beat your wife with a stick no wider than your thumb, which you remember is called the thumb rule. Slavery for a lot of Americans is becoming intolerable. Americans are finding Jesus at this time, and they're asking themselves a question: how many slaves would Jesus own? None. Well, then why is slavery allowed in a nation which preaches equality and has people who have found Jesus? So a lot of Americans are wanting to begin to end slavery, and you have urban decay, unhealthy work conditions, and no public education. Cities are beginning to expand with no types of regulations or codes. So the cities are places of filth. Now, the spoil system, aka patronage. This is going to be around for years and years and years in politics. And what it is rewarding political supporters with political jobs and power. Now, why is this such a big deal? What's the problem with the spoil system? What it is if you help me get elected, I'll get you a job in government. And having a government job back then was a pretty good, well paying job. So I'll put you in a job, and that sounds good. I mean, what is the problem with me, if I was a politician, bringing in all my friends who are my buddies and they work well with me and we can work well together into government? Well, the problem here with this is you're getting inexperienced people who get their jobs based on who they know, like me, not what they know. So you don't have experts running the government. And a great example of that in action, which causes a panic, is the bank crisis of the United States. Now, remember, the Bank of the United States is not in the Constitution, and it is a central bank of the government. And because it's not in the Constitution, it was given a charter for 20 years. So there's been the first Bank of the United States, and then it was renewed in the 18 teens, and it's the second charter of the Bank of the United States is coming up for renewal. Now, what happens here is it's not renewed, and this causes the Panic of 1837, which is the largest depression America had ever seen up until this point, and it's only surpassed by the Panic of 1892 and the Great Depression. And this was created because Jackson declined to recharter the Bank of the United States. Now, why did President Jackson not like the Bank of the United States? Well, he saw it as an institution that favored the rich and foreign investors. Also, he was a strict constructionist. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say there should be a federal bank. So his idea is to give it to the states, let the states run these banks. So what he does is when he doesn't charter the bank again, all that money flows down to pet banks. Now, these banks are state banks, and these state banks want to make credit available to the people in their area to curry favor. So they put out tons of money for people to borrow. When people are able to borrow money, they want to go out and buy land. So the demand of land increases and the price of land goes up as banks kept putting out more and more borrowed money in the hands of ordinary Americans. Eventually, the banks realize they've overextended themselves. They've put out more loans than they have funds in their bank. So they basically turn around to a lot of their depositors and say, hey, we need our money back. So banks call in their loans called specie circular, and the panic begins to set in. The people who are loaned the money say, I don't have the money. I have land. I have to sell my land. So all of a sudden, like the stock market crash, rather than people selling stocks, people are selling land. And then people began to default on their loans to the banks. And what you get in the panic of 1837, banks can't get the money back and the banks go bankrupt. And from 1837 to 1843, we have one of the worst economic crises in history up until that point. Now, here's what you need to recognize. How could the panic of 1837 have been prevented? And here's the sad thing about the Panic of 1837. It didn't have to happen. It was basically created because of the spoil system. If you end the spoil system and had competent, experienced leadership, they would have said, we need to keep the Bank of the United States in business because it makes sure that Americans have access to money. And getting rid of it, it created all these fluctuations that caused the worst economic crisis in American history up until that point. Now, Native Americans and the 5 civilized tribes. Now, in the southwest of the United States, in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, there are 5 tribes of Indians called the 5 civilized tribes, in particular the Cherokees, who made attempts to try to integrate or assimilate into American culture. So rather than fighting Americans, they said, look, we want to be a part of American culture. So the Cherokees, they're the tribe that made the greatest effort at assimilating. And if you can remember, they created an alphabet, they created their own newspaper called the Phoenix, they took on American names. The leader of the Cherokee was Chief John Ross, okay? And they even got into the market system, started growing cotton, and even started buying slaves. The state of Georgia, in an effort to try to get Indian land from the Cherokees, the state of Georgia kicked the Cherokees out. Well, the Cherokees, having assimilated, when you are being done wrong, the Cherokees then sued the state of Georgia, saying, no, we have a right to stay in Georgia. We were here first. It's our land. We claimed it. It's ours. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, this case, and the Supreme Court decides with the Cherokees. The Supreme Court says the Cherokees can stay on their land. Of course they can. They were there first. Well, President Jackson, who made his name as an Indian fighter and an Indian killer, okay, basically says he ignores the decision, even though that's the president's job, which is to enforce the law. And the Supreme Court said the law says the Cherokees get to stay. Jackson kicked the Cherokees off of the land and the other tribes and moved them west, and that's called the Trail of Tears. This is the first forced march of Cherokees to Oklahoma, where 15,000 moved and 1/4 died of starvation and exhaustion. Now, what is really so criminal and repulsive about this journey? How does this violate American ideals? Can you remember? And the answer is it's not that America kicked people off their land. We're going to do that again and again and again. What's repulsive about this is the people who died all died from preventable deaths. They died of starvation, they died of disease, they died of exhaustion. All that had to be done was to just let them rest more and feed them more, and everyone would have made it over there. Now, how do you think Americans reacted when they heard the news that thousands of innocent Indians died? They did not care. Americans wanted the land in the Southwest, right, in order to grow cotton. And Andrew Jackson, why was he not impeached for ignoring the Supreme Court decision? Because no American was going to impeach a president for doing what Americans wanted, which was manifest destiny, taking the land. Now, another incident that happened in the South is going to be the Nullification Crisis. Okay. Now, the Nullification Crisis begins with the Tariff of Abominations. Now, what it's called the Tariff of Abominations by South Carolina. One part of the American system is to put tariffs on imported goods in order to get Americans to buy American products. So by taxing English goods at a higher rate, at a higher price, Americans buy American. Okay. So what the problem with this is it affects South Carolina because South Carolina they export goods to England. And when America puts a high tariff on England, England turns around and puts a high tariff in England on American cotton. And this causes an economic crisis in South Carolina where England's no longer buying South Carolina cotton. So John C. Calhoun, the upper left-hand corner, basically proposes the idea of nullification. And this is the idea that the states have a right to ignore acts by the federal government if they feel the government went too far. And in this case, South Carolina felt that the tariff imposed by the federal government hurt South Carolina economically indirectly. So South Carolina is going to ignore the tariff. Now, if the federal government wants to try to enforce the tariff in South Carolina then says it has the right to ultimately secede. The 13 independent colonies, right? Remember, at once were sovereign states. So South Carolina is saying, look, we were originally an independent country, and if the federal government does what we don't like, we can leave. Now, Jackson's response, being a nationalist and from a Western state, he's like, look, this is treason. I'm going to threaten to invade South Carolina. And this gets sorted out. The tariff of abominations is reduced and whatnot. And John C. Calhoun and Jackson get along. But what is nullification setting up in the 1830s that's important? What precedent is it setting up? You can see it in the image in the middle there. It's setting up in the future the Civil War. Nullification setting a precedent that a state has a right to secede if the state feels the government goes too far in their opinion. The idea here is if the federal government tries to ban slavery, then the southern states will secede from the Union. All right, guys. That's it. Thank you very much. The next one coming up is going to be Chapter 7, Part 2. Look for that soon.